Okay, now it's time to review the ordinary level paper 2 from 2026. So, having looked through this in somewhat slightly more detail than the higher level paper, um, I've slightly better remembrance of this paper, and I remember when I looked through it first, I was concerned because a lot of the questions seemed very higher levelly. Um, Introductory higher levelly, yes, but a bit strange for a lot of the questions. But let's go through it. Again, just the usual thing. You know, people don't tend to watch about the higher and the ordinary. So what I mentioned in the higher level video was anyone who's looking at solutions, I recommend not doing that because it'll only just increase your anxiety. In that, if you remember writing down 8 for an answer and the solution person gives it 12.5, then yeah, you're gonna have some sort of increased anxiety feelings. So I wouldn't recommend looking at the solutions. I do know students are desperate, but coming from an actual teacher rather than just someone who's a little bit good at mathematics, um, I wouldn't recommend looking at those solutions. That's why I tend to do them after all the results come out. So let's go through the questions. Question 1, pretty straightforward line question. And some including of the area of the triangle, which I did review with a couple of the students, the 2 different methods. And in this one, you could have actually used either because one of the vertices is the origin. So, you could have done the half base by height, or you could have done the half mod x1 y2 minus x2 y1. Both methods here are acceptable. Then working out the slope of a line, and then a slightly complicated setup or a slightly more involved setup for ordinary. Finding some perpendicular line through these 2 points. Well, more so looking for the value of r. So, question 2 involved putting some combinations together. Fairly okay 2-way table. Now, as is traditional with a lot of the 2-way tables and even tables in general, there's probably a lot of marks going for it. So even tables like that, not last year, but last year and the year before actually, were worth upwards of like 10 to 15 marks just filling in a table. So pretty okay once you've filled in a couple of bits of information, and then a pretty nice part 3. Part B was actually also okay. This is just effectively continued events. Not too bad of a question. Again, I practiced a lot of these with the ordinary level cohort. So this that should have been okay if they followed the same strategies. Part 3 was some combinations questions. So fairly okay, just using the fundamental theorem of algebra. And then another somewhat conceptual question. Of course, you could get away with it just doing calculations, but conceptually it's actually okay to see which category to remove. But of course, you could have done the calculations to do it. And then some fairly okay rearrangement questions. So seemingly some kind of similar elements because we have sort of rearranging probabilities of different successive things happening. And we have the same thing here where we have a bunch of different arrangements and successions. Part 4, not too bad of a start in trigonometry and geometry technically, but it's more geometry in that we have an isosceles triangle, so the angles across are equal, and then you have the angle in a straight line. And then you have the area of a triangle question, which is just half of the 2 sides formed between an angle times the sine of the angle. So not too bad once you knew the formula. And then part B, once you drew the diagram, again, as it mentions here, it might be useful to draw a diagram. Once that's done, you can actually pretty easily work out QPR. So not too bad of a question. I'd say a lot of people were pretty happy about that. It was a slightly predicted topic. I mean, not slightly, but very much predicted topic. And nice to have it come up in a short question. Question 5 was about can't even think of it, but the different kinds of averages and statistical terms. So noting the mode, range, and median. Once you know what they were, this question was actually pretty straightforward. And again, there's some they're incorporating a lot of the conceptual questions where they're swaying away from all the questions being about calculation. So I definitely thought this one would have taken a little bit longer. That's still entirely possible. Oh, I skipped a bit. One involving expected value and a spinner, which is pretty okay. You just use the expected value formula and everything actually falls out from there. Now, question 6. Enlargements we hadn't really expected to come up. This is a bit of an odd one, but definitely entirely doable, even if you didn't know what enlargements were. This one you did need a ruler, and it led you actually pretty easily to the scale factor. Though constructing the center of enlargement might have been a bit difficult for different students. And then part B, again, was sort of logic-based geometry. It looked a bit of a scary diagram, but the questions they asked were pretty okay. So just noting that we have a radial line, and then some stuff involving similarity, which you could pretty easily do once you knew the basic theorems. So overall, a nice mix of questions. There were definitely some hiccups, similar enough to actually the paper 1, where a lot of the short questions were fine, but some specific subparts might have required a decent bit of thought. But of course, all the marks, well, most of the marks are going to be allocated to the sort of first few parts. So it's not going to be 20 marks for like the part C's or something. So question 7 starts off with a pretty, a very familiar circle question, writing down the center and radius, and then investigating if a point is in or outside of a circle. Bit of a nice context to it. I can definitely think a lot of people would be able to easily visualize this. Though a lot of this is actually done in terms of context of the game, which, for anyone that wants to do game design, this is something that needs to be done. So equation of line through 2 points is okay. Though this question here, the part double I, you could do it using simultaneous equations, or you could somewhat sketch this out and try reason it that way. Kind of whatever method sort of worked to you. If you're using simultaneous equations, I'm pretty sure you need to show, well, not pretty sure, but if I kind of think of this in my head, it's to show that there is only one point of intersection, which defines it as a tangent. I'm not sure why I said probably. That is just definitely what happens there. Now we have another construction going on, so those who maybe forgot their math sets might have been a decent bit of trouble. But then we have center and radius and the equation. So pretty much just the inverse of this, where they give you the equation, find center and radius, and here they give you center and radius and ask you for the equation. So they've basically asked the same question twice, which I thought was a bit bizarre, but it's nice marks. And then, again, another somewhat conceptual question. You just needed a horizontal line that didn't cross any of the circles. So actually a pretty nice circle long question. Again, definitely some parts which were possibly a bit challenging. So involving simultaneous equations was a bit bizarre, to put it one way, because that's usually a paper 1 topic, specific to ordinary level. But the rest of the questions were actually pretty manageable, and definitely parts were decently attainable. Question 8, some pretty nice trig. So if you knew your trig and your SOHCAHTOA, again, these two always come up in pairs. So knowing your Pythagoras and knowing your SOHCAHTOA does come in pretty handy. Then the trapezoidal rule came up. Again, it's one we were kind of expecting. Pretty sure the last time was 2024 or 3. Can't remember. There's one involving percentage error. Was the one I was referencing. So hadn't come up in a while, so we were almost expecting it to make an appearance. And rightly it does so. And then part C, another trig-based question. Again, this one required a tiny bit of thought. Just working at this distance x to y. You do a little bit of angle stuff. But actually not too bad once you cracked it. And then lastly, part D. Not actually too bad, just again using a length of a sector formula. And then just manipulating the sector equation, which is a common thing that comes up, especially with slightly complex formulae like the volume of a sphere or the volume of a cylinder. Those kind of questions, they tend to ask you to sub into a formula and then rearrange the formula for something else. So definitely something that you would have seen in, maybe in a slightly different form, but definitely something that was easily manageable. Starting to question 9, mean and standard deviation. I did practice this with a student before on Sunday and was really happy to see this coming up because they tend to be, again, pretty decent marks, so 10 to 15 usually. And then again, just noting effectively more definitions of measures of central tendency. That's the word I'm looking for. Though in this case, it is just another statistical term, so it effectively asked you if you knew what an outlier was. Okay, empirical rule, something that students kind of struggle with a little bit because it is just a thing of remembering. Actually pretty okay. This time they kind of asked it in reverse, where they gave you the percentage and asked you to use the empirical rule rather than the other way around, which, we were kind of expecting something like that, different phraseology to come up. Yeah, and then this part C. It's pretty much the most bog standard inferential statistics question, and it always comes up in the same form. They ask you for the population proportion, then they ask you for the error, though this time they asked it the other way around, and then they ask you to carry out a hypothesis test using a confidence interval. So, yeah, honestly, the most bog standard questions. Like, if you practiced even the past 3 inferential stats questions, you would have seen a very similar pattern come up. And then question 4, again, a slightly more conceptual question, just involving the margin of error. So, I mean, this question was absolutely beautiful. Like, it really was. I'd say everyone in the country who sat ordinary level on Monday would have answered question 9. Question 10, volume of a couple of things. So, knowing the volume of a cone and the volume of a hemisphere. Again, might be slightly conceptually difficult to see that the radius carries over. So, the radius of the hemisphere is the same as the radius of a cone. And noting that hemisphere is half of a sphere. So, those who were looking for a hemisphere volume formula would have gone out a look. You have to note that that was just half of a sphere. Then some kind of volume redo. So you define a volume of 1 and then relate that to the second volume. And then some stuff involving percentage increase. So all of the percentage formulas are the percentage increase, decrease, error, discount. Like, that general formula is in there. You find the difference between the two of them and you divide it by the original to find the percentage increase. But I do understand, students might have seen this term and kind of wondered what to do. Though usually any decent effort would have awarded a nice chunk of marks. And then this question involving placing cans on a shelf. Again, slightly okay to see. You just say that we're looking for the diameter and seeing how many full diameters you can fit on the shelf before any cans fall off. And then this somewhat okay question, just involving a percentage decrease. But again, did require a little bit of critical thinking. But of course, there's extra space here in case you want to trial a solution before you put it in the actual box. But overall, definitely a nice question to wrap up a fairly difficult starting question, which is sort of the opposite how I see with a lot of ordinary level questions. It's not very common to see the slightly more difficult question to come up right at the beginning. So overall, my thoughts. Again, pretty similar to paper 1 in terms of content that comes up. So definitely a wide array of parts of the course that came up. And again, similar to paper 1 and actually similar to most of the other paper 2s that I've seen. It's definitely a case of a lot of the parts were very easy to start. Start parts of the questions pretty okay. But the latter stages, so the part C, D, and E's, that kind of area, everything after part B in a lot of the questions, they were all pretty difficult and did require a decent bit of thinking. So, out of maths, those who really didn't like maths, congratulations, you managed to stick it out. And yeah, no more difficult maths whatsoever. And best of luck to everyone else in the rest of their exams.